Today I have an alternative method for sewing together the bodice of the Vogue 9076. I absolutely love this dress, as you guys know. I have made a lot of alterations and changes to this dress to make it work for me. One of the things that I dislike about this dress is the waistline with the overlap that comes from this theoretically being a fully functional button up front. Because I have changed the closure method from a fully functional button up front with press studs on the skirt to a side zip, I have, in my previous iterations, it still included the modesty panel and the button up section, but it's not needed. And because I have included that, it has left me with an overlap at the waistline, which means that I can't finish the waist with my usual method of press all the seam allowance up, press the lining seam allowance under, and then hand stitch it together because of the way that things meet at the center front. It doesn't matter if you are fully lining the dress, which is usually my preference, and you are fully lining the skirt part of the dress as well, because you don't need to worry so much about that area. You can sew the skirt lining to the bodice lining and just cover everything up. But with this dress, it was already going to be a very fabric hungry beast of a dress, and it was going to be very voluminous, so I didn't want to add a skirt lining to this in case in the future I wanted to wear this with a petticoat. I also, as I say, just wanted to try out this different method of finishing the bodice. So there are a few different steps to the regular sew along, which you can find up here and linked in the description down below. So this is how I put together this dress to have a clean finish at the waistline with no skirt lining. Basically, we're getting up to step 12 before you need to alter the way that you are following the instructions. If you have come to this video for the first time and you haven't seen my original video of the sew along for this dress, you probably want to go back and watch that. I have changed a lot about this dress. I've also changed the way that the collar goes in. I don't agree with this method. It's a lot of hand sewing for no reason. As you can see in the coming up clips, the collar is attached at this point and then sandwiched between this outer yoke and the inner yoke, regardless of whether you have a full lining in it or not. And again, if you've come to this video for the first time and you've not seen my original sew along, the only reason that we are able to get away with sewing this front and not having these buttons be functional and taking away this modesty placket is because I've included a side zipper as the closure. But basically, this is the step that we're getting up to before we deviate from the suggested instructions in the pattern. This, as you probably know, is my 5th iteration of the Vogue 9076 dress, and I really like it. But one of the things that I found from the very first one was that I didn't like the closure method. So I have moved the closure method from a functional button and press stud on the skirt to a side zipper, which means that whilst all the other dresses that I've done still have functional front buttons, the skirt opening has been sewn closed, and so this realistically is actually decorative. There is a different method of finishing this bodice so that you don't have to include the button guard, and you also will have an easier time finishing off the waistband of the lining of this dress without that additional piece in there. It's very much the same as the McCall's 7537 method, and it's a very similar bodice to this one. Rather than sew the lining to the bodice along the center front and go around the neckline and back down this side, I'm actually going to take the two center front pieces and sew them together now. I still want the button detail on there, so I have included my button loops, which hopefully you can see. As always, I'm using a really busy print, but I have included my button loops, so I have got the 5 button loops on there. It's the same spacing as the previous dress. So what I want to do is match up the midriff points, and I'm going to sew from the waistline, and I'm going to sew to 5/8 of an inch above the last button loop. So I'm going to take my ruler, got a line of stitching that goes right from the top of the first button loop, so there. So I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch above that. So I want to take my bodice, turn it so that the right sides are together, and keeping the button loops flat, I'm going to pin it together along the center front from the waistline up until 5/8 of an inch above that last button loop. Just make sure that everything else is matching up nice and neatly. So I'm going to match up the midriff to make sure that that gets sewn together and matches perfectly. There we go, that's pinned into place. And I'm literally going to sew up the centre front at 5/8 of an inch, which is the regular seam allowance, all the way up the front. And I'm going to do the same for the lining piece as well. If you're not fully lining your dress, which the pattern doesn't initially call for, you want to do the same thing for your lining yoke, even if you've not attached the lining to your bodice lining like I have, because I prefer the finish that you can achieve on this dress with fully lining the bodice. And if you followed along with the main sew along, you will have seen that. So I'm going to basically do the exact same thing with this lining piece, but like I say, if you're not fully lining it, you're going to do exact same thing with the yoke lining. Currently they are still separate. I have got the collar sewn on the outside of the dress, so I'm going to match up my midriff pieces here. Obviously this is not quite as important, but you do want them to match because that means you are sewing everything together accurately. I'm just going to get my lining piece sewn up in exactly the same manner to exactly the same point, and that's the important thing. You want to make sure that everything is lining up exactly, because we're going to press this seam open and then we're going to sew it together the same way that you would sew together, for example, the 7/5/3/7. I'm just going to check how high up this comes, because I do prefer a lower cut dress. That is my preference, so I might actually move my finishing part down slightly. You basically want to sew up the center front of your dress to your desired height, as long as it covers the button loops, and as I say, my button loops finish there, so I might actually move it down to the end of my button loops, but I'm not 100% sure yet. I will double check it. What you could do is sew either your outer or your inner together and double check and see if you like where that's hitting on you, and adjust accordingly, because you can always unpick the top of the stitching and just lower or raise the neckline if you would like to. But this is the first step for a different method of finishing off the bodice. So these are 5/8 of an inch, matching up all of the midriff seams and making sure that it's to the height that you want. You will, as I say, have already sewn in your button loops, and I also find it easier to sew in my collar when the bodice is flatter, so the collar has been sewn in and the button loops have been included. Technically you don't have to put the button loops in if you don't want to. You could just sew the buttons onto this dress, or you could leave it plain, but I like how the button loops look with the buttons. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch. I have sewn the center front of the outer and the center front of my lining together. I've got my midriff points matching up really nicely. I have pressed it so that the seam is open and all of the button loops have come over to the left as you're wearing it, because that is the side that I'm going to be putting the buttons on. So the thing that I want to do now is turn my lining so that it is inside out, and we are going to match up the neckline of the lining with the neckline of the bodice pieces. Now you're going to need to match up that point that we've just sewn, and you want to keep all of the seam allowances out of the way, so you're only going to be able to match up one side at a time. And what I mean by that is I'm going to put a pin through one layer of the outer fabric at the point, the exact point that I've sewn up to, and I'm going to find the exact point on the corresponding bodice piece and put my pin through there. And that's where we're going to start our line of stitching. Now, as I say, you're only going to be able to do that on one side because you're going to be pushing all the seam allowance over and it's going to be covering the other side. We're going to be going all the way around the neckline from stitching point to stitching point, and so once you've started you'll be able to take this pin out, and then once you've got enough like to round to the center back, the work will be accessible enough for you to repin the center point on the other side. Again, this is very much like the bodice on the 7/5/3/7, which there is a full sew along on the channel for. Yeah, I'm going to match up my shoulder seams and pin everything flat. I'm going to match up any notches that there are and any corners. If you have any corners like we do at the neckline, you can draw your seam allowance in to make sure that you maintain the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance neatly around those corners. We're going to be sandwiching the collar in between these. As I mentioned, the collar has been sewn on previously to make that easier. So I'm just pinning the bodice outer to the bodice lining, right sides together all the way around the neckline from stitching point to stitching point. Hopefully I can show you a little better what I was talking about, but I have started my stitching at the point that I finished off the center front stitching, and I've back stitched and I've gone all the way around the neckline, and then when I got to about here I left my needle down and I had enough fabric outside of the machine that I could readjust everything so that I could move the seam allowances over the stitching that I'd already done, and that way I could finish up my stitching at the other side of the seam allowances. So we started here, started on that side and then moved everything over to finish on this side, and it's all nice and neatly done. You can check that you've got everything in the right place by opening up the seam like this and having a look at the point. If you can see through it, if there's a little hole there, you need to either by hand just finish that off or go back in and work out where the hole is and finish it off with a couple more lines of machine stitching. But when you turn this through, obviously we need to clip the neckline around the corners and the curve of the collar, but when you turn this through you can see that it's nicely joined together. I'm going to clip into the curve of my collar to release it. I'm going to trim away some of the excess bulk. I'm going to clip off the corners of my seam allowances, and then at the corner of my collar here I'm going to clip into that corner and take away the bulk so this all turns through really nicely. Once that's done, I'm going to have a look and see if understitching will help everything sit where it should. It probably will, so it probably will be the next step. But clipping and trimming my seam allowances is the first step. I have turned it out, and before it's been pressed, this is what it's looking like. I'm very happy with this. I'm going to go back in and attempt to press this seam at least open first along my sleeve ham. So let's go in between the layers, and yeah, I should be able to get in here nicely and press this seam allowance open, and I'm going to do that for both sides because I think that is going to help me get a really nice finish on this edge. I'm still debating whether I'm going to understitch or not. If I'd used something that was very obviously a different color to the outer fabric, I might be persuaded to really attempt to get some understitching in there. I don't think it necessarily matters around the collar because the collar obviously stands up and is not going to allow the lining to roll out, but along this front, because of all the corners, I'm only really going to be able to understitch maybe sort of like 2/3 of it. So I'm going to give it a good press, as I say, pressing the seam open before I press it flat, and see how that answers. I think it's going to actually be preferable to trying to get understitching in there, which is not going to be the easiest of things. But yes, we have an almost finished bodice. I just need to sew the top of this side up, and then I can put the sleeves in, and then I can attach it to the skirt. It's going to be a very loud dress, but I am very much looking forward to wearing this. Hopefully that all makes sense. It's very similar to the way the McCall's 7537 is put together, which there is a sew along for. You can find that up here and also listed in the description down below. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section down below, but hopefully I think I've covered everything. If you've enjoyed this video, you might like this one here.